The lake's quiet fisherman stops a drowning, and this act of courage brings his underwater past to light. Before you start, share where you watched this video today in the comments. Ely, a quiet lake town in northern Minnesota near the Canadian border, had been home to nature's tranquility for centuries. Pine forests awoke to the sound of birds echoing around the clear lake shrouded in morning mist. Every morning, the same scene unfolded along the shore of Ely Lake. A gray-haired, burly man would board a small wooden boat and quietly cast his line into the water. His name was Walter Brennan. But the town always referred to him by another name, the Lake Keeper. There was no official record of this title at the town hall, nor did he have an official role. But everyone knew that when Walt was there, the lake was calmer, the waters more peaceful. He was the first to arrive at the lake in the morning and the last to leave at night. His face had hardened over the years from the sun, but in his eyes, the traces of another life that once shone like steel still burned. He was usually silent. The townspeople teased him playfully, "Uncle Walt, what did the lake whisper to you today?" they would say. He would just smile and continue reeling in his line without speaking. The young people didn't pay much attention to him, they saw him as an old statue sitting on a bench. Over time, he had become a man who was ignored not for his eyes or ears, but for his very existence. However, there was one young person who observed Walt every morning, Sarah. She was one of the town's young fishermen. She would take her fishing rod early in the morning and sit by the lake, a few meters away from Walt, enjoying her own silence. After a while, she began to notice that Walt's hands were remarkably steady for his age. There was no hesitation or slowness in his movements. His eyes constantly scanned the water, not just for fish, but as if searching for something else. And there was always a noticeable bulge in his left jacket pocket. No one asked what it was, it couldn't be asked anyway. Walt was that kind of person. And then that day came. It was a scorching July afternoon in 2025. The children at Ely Lake had gone into the water, swimming joyfully and shouting with delight. The adults were resting in the shade along the shore, and boats glided slowly across the lake's surface. Walt was in his boat again, carrying the morning silence into the afternoon, as if he were in another era, casting his line. Just then, a scream was heard. A young boy, about 15 years old, the son of a family that had recently moved to the town, suddenly began thrashing around in the lake in panic. Perhaps his foot had cramped, or perhaps he had momentarily lost his bearings in the water. The waves grew, and the boy screamed. The people on the lake shore didn't know what to do. "Does anyone know how to swim? Help!" Amidst the screams, there was a moment of silence. And that silence was broken by the sound of wood crashing from Walt's boat. Walt suddenly stood up. The fishing rod had flown to the side. He took off his jacket, carefully folded the mysterious bulge in his pocket, and placed it inside the box. Then, with an agility that years had not given him, he pushed the boat into the water. He did not row, he dived into the water. He had thrown off his jacket, leaving his aged body to the coolness of the water. The crowd held its breath. Walt reached the child with his strong arms. He made a maneuver underwater, took the child's arm over his shoulder, and surfaced. Dozens of eyes watched the rebirth of a hero on the water's surface. When he brought the child to shore, Sarah immediately helped. Others gathered around, clapping. But Walt did not accept the applause. He simply bowed his head, gently stroking his slightly damp beard, and asked, "Are you okay, son?" At that moment, everyone thought the same thing: who was this old man? How had the man who had sat quietly by the lake for so many years reacted with such reflexes, such certainty, such precision? And Sarah was certain of one thing at that moment: Walt was not just a part of the lake. Perhaps he had once been someone who had saved and protected something. And now, at Ely Lake, it was not just fish that had surfaced, it was also a legacy from the past. After the rescue, a silence still hung over the lake shore. The waves gently lapped at the shore, and the brief but intense panic in the water had given way to a mix of wonder and curiosity. Sarah stood barefoot on the pebbles along the lake shore, watching Walt. Water trickled down the old man's chest, and his gray hair clung to his forehead. But his eyes were calm. He sought no praise, nor did he react to the astonishment around him. Sarah took a few steps forward, her hands trembling involuntarily. "Walt," she said hesitantly. "That was incredible. Swimming out to pull someone from that current, how did you do it?" Walt slowly turned his head. He didn't answer. But he paused for a moment, and his jacket opened slightly. Sarah's eyes caught sight of a faintly metallic object glinting in the sun. An old medal pinned to his chest. On it was a rusting diver's mask, a star, and a single year engraved below, 1969. Sarah shuddered. 1969, one of Vietnam's darkest years. Without making eye contact, Walt simply said, "It was just a reflex," and slowly turned his back and started walking away. No one stopped him. But the silence inside Sarah had turned into a scream. She wanted answers. That night, the sky was pitch black, but Sarah's mind was filled with stars. The small library in Ely was known for its silence. The old wooden floors creaked, and time seemed to stand still between the bookshelves. Sarah ran up the stairs and sat down at the dusty computer desk. She accessed the old digital newspaper archives. She typed in, "Walter Brennan Vietnam." At first, there were no results. Then she expanded her search. Vietnam, 1969, diver rescue. And there it was. A faded military report, with sentences censored in places. During an operation on the Mekong River, a river mine clearance unit came under heavy fire. A sergeant neutralized the underwater munitions, allowing 8 soldiers to retreat. This unnamed soldier was later reported missing in action. Sarah leaned closer to the screen. Her eyes searched between the lines. Finally, a phrase in the lower paragraph caught her attention. Sergeant WB had a small eagle tattoo on his chest, just above his left arm, when he surfaced. Sarah paused for a moment. Walt always kept his left arm covered with a long-sleeved shirt. But one day last summer, when his shirt had ridden up, she had seen the eagle's wings. It couldn't be a coincidence. The next morning, the lake shore was quiet again. The sun had not yet fully risen. As the birds chirped, Walt was preparing his boat as usual. At his feet was an old fishing basket, and beside it a rusty oar. Sarah approached with a copy of the report taken from the old printer in her hand. Her heart was pounding. "Walt," she said, her voice soft but firm like the wind, "that medal. Were you in Vietnam? Were you a diver?" Walt's shoulders tensed slightly. He let go of the fishing line in his hand. He turned his head toward Sarah. His eyes seemed focused on a distant point, but then he looked directly into her eyes. His voice was almost a whisper, "Yes." Sarah held her breath. "What about that report?" she continued, holding out the paper. "Were you the diver who saved the soldiers?" Walt didn't answer. He slowly took the paper, examined it. His eyes lingered on the letters for a moment, then returned to the lake. "Some stories stay in the water," he said in a low voice. "But the traces, they always wash up on shore." As she turned back to the boat, Sarah noticed for the first time the weight in Walt's gait. He was not just an old fisherman, but a diver from the depths of the past. A man who had carried a lifetime in silence beneath the water. And now, on the surface of Ely Lake, that silence was beginning to echo. As Sarah continued to watch Walt, she realized he was not just fishing. The way Walt cast his line, reeled it in, waited patiently, none of it was ordinary. This wasn't a retired man's hobby, it was almost a ritual. His silence, his listening to his surroundings, his noticing the slightest movement, these weren't the habits of an ordinary man. Sarah's mind returned to the moment she had saved the drowning child. Those quick reflexes, the dive into the water, the grasping of the child. These were the skills of a trained person. With these thoughts, Sarah made her way to the town sheriff. "Sheriff, what do you know about Walt?" she asked, with genuine curiosity. The sheriff adjusted his glasses and paused for a moment. "Walter Brennan? He's a quiet man. He doesn't meddle in anyone's business. But yes, sometimes he looks as if he's somewhere else. His eyes seem to scan something. Once, a boat capsized on the lake. Walt was there immediately. It was as if he knew what was going to happen. People were amazed, but he never explained. He just walked to the shore and lit a cigarette." Sarah was excited. "Did he ever mention his military past?" The sheriff shook his head. "No. But if he has a medal like you say, I wonder why he's keeping it a secret." That night, Sarah returned to the library. The wind was beating against the windows, and the pages were turning on their own. She searched the archives, the digital databases, the Vietnam War reports, the old newspapers. And finally, she got stuck on a yellow document from 1969. During a river operation, American soldiers had been ambushed by the enemy, and their boats had been surrounded by mines. It was a matter of life and death. At that moment, an unnamed diver had dived into the water and, in the murky, muddy water where visibility was zero, had neutralized the mines one by one. At the end of the operation, 10 soldiers had been rescued. The names had been erased from the document, but somewhere, a small note caught her attention: Corporal Walter Brennan, recommended for an award. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes filling with tears. She was certain now. Uncle Walt, that quiet, humble man, had been a hero years ago. But why hadn't he told anyone? Why hadn't he made the newspapers, received awards? Why had he chosen to live in this small town, like an ordinary fisherman? The next day, Sarah was at the lake again. Walt was preparing his fishing rod in the morning mist. In one hand he held an old thermos, in the other a worn box of worms. Sarah approached quietly. "Walt," she said, her voice soft at first, "I know everything. The river operation, the medal, saving those children." Walt turned his head, but there was no anger in his eyes, only a distant sadness. He remained silent for a moment. Then he slowly let go of the fishing rod and spoke, "Some stories are not meant to be told, but to be carried." Sarah froze. Walt's eyes were as deep as the lake now. And in that moment, Sarah understood, Walt was not just a fisherman, but a living monument to war, loss, and quiet courage. When Sarah began sharing Walt's story in the town, no one paid much attention at first. But as the old man's past came to light, people began to see him in a different light. Once seen as just a quiet fisherman casting his line, Walt was now the living embodiment of a legend hanging over the lake. One morning, an old soldier came to town. His name was Tom. He walked slowly to the lake shore and approached the pier where Walt was sitting. "Walter Brennan?" he asked. Walt looked up and met Tom's eyes. There was a brief silence. Then Tom spoke, "In 1969, I was in that river. You pulled me out seconds before the explosion. We were underwater, I couldn't see anything. But you were there." These words seemed to echo across the lake's surface. Tom's voice trembled. All that remained was a simple thank you, but behind it lay years of gratitude. After that day, the townspeople began to treat Walt with more respect and care. The young people watched him from a distance, and the children no longer passed by the chair he had set up by the lake without greeting him. Walt, however, had not changed. He would take his fishing rod in the morning, quietly go down to the lake shore, and watch the water. But he was no longer alone. A week later, the town's traditional fishing festival was held. The organizing committee invited Walt as a special guest. At first, he hesitated, but then accepted at Sarah's insistence. No one knew what would happen when he took the stage. Despite his elderly body, Walt jumped into the boat. He rowed to the middle of the lake. Then he put on a diving suit and silently dove into the water. Minutes passed. The crowd held its breath. Then a rope appeared on the surface of the lake. Walt had emerged from under the water, demonstrating an old rescue technique. He pulled a young volunteer into the lake using the rope and successfully brought him to shore. Applause erupted. Walt, who was applauded standing up, was not only a hero of the past but also of the present. Another story was written that day in Ely. The next morning, there were more people than usual on the lake shore. Walt's chair had become a symbolic place. Sarah handed him a small note, "The town is proud of you." Walt took off his glasses and read the note. He smiled without saying a word and put the note in his shirt pocket. Then he slowly raised his head. "Perhaps the lake is still protecting its guardian," he said quietly. From that day on, the townspeople no longer called him by his name. Everyone referred to him as the lake's guardian. The postman, the shop owner, the children. Everyone embraced this title. The local history museum sent a special invitation asking Walt to donate his medal and diving mask. Walt donated his belongings to the museum. But with one condition: don't write my name next to it, write the lives I saved. On the day of the ceremony, a crowd gathered in front of the museum. Inside the glass case, there was a medal, a mask, and a short note: "True heroes don't make a sound. They pass by like water, but their traces are deep." At the ceremony, an elderly woman stepped forward. She approached slowly and spoke through tears, "My son was also in that operation. He is alive because of you. We always wondered who had saved us. It turns out you were here. You were always here." At that moment, Walt's face softened. For the first time, tears streamed down his cheeks. But these tears were not of regret, but of acceptance, of closure. As birds glided through the sky, the lake was calm. Silent. Just like Walt. And the story ended with this question. Have you ever met someone like Walt? A hero who silently guards the water,